Tonight, we are starting on our new webinar series talking about problem tanks. Lots of topics in this webinar series, from algae to sick and dying fish to coral growth, coral color. So we're going to talk about a lot of these things that I get a lot of questions about and things that I sometimes have to deal with in clients' tanks as well. Because as I tell clients, the easy part is designing it and building it. Then the hard part, I say hard and I use that term loosely, the more challenging, the more unknowns come in once the tank is up and rolling, and then you're trying to grow coral in it. So here's the thing. If you're a fish-only person, look, a fish-only tank is really easy. It's cake. A lot different than growing coral. And growing soft corals is a heck of a lot easier than growing SPS. So there are different levels on all this. And there's going to be different things that affect you where you are in your tank career. One thing about your tank career and dealing with these types of issues is tank issues can affect anyone. Not so much fish and disease, because if you set things up properly there, you quarantine, you take care of your fish, you really shouldn't have much of an issue. I'm really talking more coral growth and coral color. One of the most frustrating things about this is that coral growth and coral color can stop and change out of nowhere for apparently no reason. So it's a great equalizer in a way. It happens to all of us. Anyone who's been in the saltwater tank hobby has had a tank that's done well, and for no apparent reason, it just stops doing well. It's happened to me. It's happened to my clients. So I'm here tonight to help you work through that and get you to a place where you're happy with your tank again. Now, if you're happy with your tank, that's great. Still tank notes, tank notes, because it's likely that you're going to run into some of these issues as you're in the hobby longer and longer. All right, so with that, we're talking about coral growth and coral color. This is part one. I'm focusing on coral growth tonight. We're going to be talking about coral color next week. Two things that are separate but related. If you're not growing things, then you're not going to color things. So let's talk about coral growth first. Now, fun thing about a saltwater tank is you set it up, you're all excited, your tank is just getting started, you got some fish in there, you've got some coral. By the way, this is my 448-gallon tank a couple years ago when I first started it, about 5 years ago actually, and you're like, this is great. Everything's going gangbusters, very likely. You're thrilled. This is awesome. You got lots of energy. You're going from there. And you start taking some photos because the growth is probably looking good. If you're an SPS head, you're like, yeah, that's nice. I would like to have that. Even if you're a LPS type person, here's a nice logo. You look at that and you're like, okay, this is great. I'm enjoying this hobby. You start to keep some anemones. This is the killer red, as I call it, in one of my clients' tanks. This thing is now about 24 inches across, and it eats anything that touches it. So you might have started your tank. You've got lots of excitement. Things are going well, and then things don't go well for sometimes no apparent reason. But you look at your tank one day and you're like, that's dying, or things don't seem to be growing. We're talking about coral here. And you're like, wait, what? I call this ADR. When I used to work for a vet, he would come in and say, okay, that horse is ADR. I'm like, what did ADR mean? He wouldn't tell me for a long time, and it took me a while actually to figure it out. ADR stands for, as we call it here in Tennessee, ain't doing right. Things just aren't right in your tank. Coral growth could be off. The coral colors could be off. Your corals could be dying. Maybe you can't keep a certain type of coral. It's clear, though, that this tank that you once loved now is like this problem child that now you have to deal with. It's just simply ADR. Now, a word of warning for you type A types, you over analytical types, or even you just plain analytical types, those of you that like to have it all figured out and think that you can reduce this whole thing to science. A word of warning. Brace yourselves. You may never know why your tank is doing well or not doing well, or in this case, because this is a problem tank webinar, why things turned around. Rarely do you find a definitive, clear, single smoking gun in this hobby. Usually it's a combination of things, and sometimes things change. sometimes things start, sometimes things stop for no apparent reason. You're like, I haven't changed anything. Mark says not to change things. I haven't changed anything. And all of a sudden, the tank isn't doing well. Corals aren't growing. Coral colors are lost. Why? All I can tell you about this is you have to learn how to dance in the gray area. No, that's not a mistake. It's actually a gray slot. There's a lot of gray area in this hobby. There's a lot that we think we know about the saltwater tank hobby, keeping corals and fish that we actually don't know. So you have to be okay with the gray area. So I'm going to give you suggestions tonight. You want to take them and apply them. But if you're looking at this, you dealing with your problem tank and you go, I'm going to find one thing and I know that this made the difference, short of you made it a freshwater tank, that's bad. That's easy to fix. That's clear that that nuked everything. It's likely a combination of things. You got to be able to dance with this. All right. Things aren't going well in your tank. We're talking about coral growth. Those things you wanted to grow, they're not growing. Why? The first thing I can tell you with this is you have to lean in to your tank at this point. When your tank ADR ain't doing right, that's the time to try harder. A lot of people, when their tank starts doing well, they look at it and they're like, oh, whatever. It's summer. I'm going to go on the boat. Forget it. I'll deal with that come fall. Even if it's winter, they're like, I'm fed up with it. I'm not going to try anymore. They throw in the towel. Now, throwing the towel doesn't necessarily mean quitting. The point is, they don't want to give it much effort. But when your tank isn't doing well, that's the time to give it more effort. This is much like a relationship. When things aren't doing well, you don't get to quit and walk away. You have to sit down and try to communicate, work things out. You have to lean into it. Same with your tank. So don't tune out. Don't give up. Give it more attention. And that may mean buying more equipment. You may have to put some dollars into your tank to get there. This is not the time to back off. All right, so we're talking about coral growth tonight. If you can't grow it, you can't color it. So we're going to talk about growing it first. Now, one thing that's missed a lot in the saltwater tank hobby that I'm always trying to put in with people is context. You have to keep in mind what you're trying to do and the implications of that. For example, for you SPS heads out there, some SPS grow slow. Now, some of you say, Mark, all SPS grow slow. Not true. Some of them grow really fast. Some of them actually grow too fast. But some grow really painstakingly slow, like this Oregon tort. True Oregon tort is known for growing really, really, really slow. So if you're growing this coral, and you have this coral and it's not growing fast, know that it's probably just doing its thing because that's what it does. Some SPS, some corals, like the pink lemonade, love this. This is a classic coral that I don't see a lot of people talk about anymore. This coral is famous for you put the frag on the rocks, even on a frag plug, and for 6 to 9 months, sometimes a year, the thing just grows out. It just encrusts. It just builds a base, and that's all it does. And you're like, I bought this coral to grow a nice colony, like Mark showed me in the slide. Why isn't it doing this? Know that it's going to spread out first, then one day it's just going to start going up. That's what it does. So you have to keep that in mind about what you're trying to do. Some corals just grow slowly. Some corals don't really appear to grow that much. For example, a lot of LPS, that is a single polyp. That thing growing is, a lot of times, it's hard to detect. This is much different than SPS, where you have a stick and then you have a branch. That's pretty easy to tell that you have growth going on. Then you have another branch, and those branches spread out. All of a sudden, things start to look a lot different. With your LPS, especially with these lobos, Trichophilius, things like that, it can be hard to tell when it's really growing unless it's grown a lot. So it may be growing, but it may not be something that you detect. Now, one of the easiest things to tell if it's growing, and a really easy coral to grow, are zoanthids, any kind of polyp, soft corals. They usually grow pretty quick. And when you have 2 polyps, then all of a sudden you have 3, it's pretty easy to detect that something is going on. Then all of a sudden you have 6, you're like, things are happening. Okay. So that being in mind, you have the context right. You've got your head straight. You know you've got to lean into your tank at this point. You're going to start putting effort into it. You know where you're going. What do you do? Well, the first thing that I do with this is I start with your numbers. With the numbers. For your analytical types, you're cheering. You're pumped. Mark's all going to talk to me about numbers. You're thrilled. Okay. I start with the numbers. What does that mean? Yes, test results. That dirty T word that a lot of people don't like to do. Yes, you need to test. You need to write down the results. you're doing that, right? I go to the numbers first. This does not mean that the numbers are the end all be all, but that's the first place that I go because it's easy to measure, and it's usually easy to measure accurately. So with all my tanks and my clients' tanks, I test my water and I write down the results. In my case, I put the results into Apex Fusion. Here's a tank that I manage here in Tennessee. These are numbers for about the past year for alkalinity. So about once to twice a week, it gets tested for alkalinity, and I write those numbers down. And I'm looking at this. Yes, we have a peak right there in the center. Overall, though, we have a nice general straight line, somewhere around the 7-ish range. That's great. I have data that I can lean on. Then I go test the tank, and I go, if this is about where the tank stays, where am I relative to that line? If I'm high above it, if I'm high below it, that means something is off on the tank. That's giving me clues. Now, the easiest place to go with this, one of the more accurate things that you can measure, besides alkalinity, is nutrients. Nutrients, the lack of or too much, can both hurt your coral growth and it can actually help it. Now, when I first started back in the saltwater tank hobby, about 2007, I think it was, back then the trend was all about zeros. 0, 0, 0. Any tank of the month, they did a profile on it. Part of the profile was what are the nutrient levels, what are the tank parameters. It was always nitrates undetectable, phosphates undetectable. That's just where it was. That's where everyone assumed that you needed to get to. Nowadays, we're pulling back from that. We're switching to the other side of things. Zeros aren't your friend anymore. You want to be a hero, you don't want to be a zero. It's not about getting down to zero all the time. For example, nitrates and phosphates, like I said, were those tank of the month back in the day. That's where everyone wanted to get. That was ideal tank parameters. Okay, maybe, but not necessarily. Where do I start when I'm thinking about tank parameters when I'm looking at a tank that isn't growing coral? Okay, salinity, this is pretty basic to me. 1.023, 1.026 specific gravity, 33 to 36 ppt for those of you that are using that range. So there's a lot of leeway in this. If you're under that, okay, then you're likely going to have coral growth problems. You're probably going to have coral death problems. If you're over it, you're probably going to have some issues as well. But there's a lot of range. I've seen reef tanks that have somehow drifted down to 1.020 because the owner didn't test, and they're growing coral really well. I've seen reef tanks get up to 1.030. So there's some leeway here. This is what I was talking about. You have to be able to dance in this. This is where I like it to be. If my tank is 1.020 and things are looking good, I'm going to go, okay, it's a little low. I'm not going to freak out. I'm going to raise my salinity, but just because the tank is happy here doesn't mean that I need to keep it here. So I'm going to start raising things to try to get in this range. Nitrates, anywhere from 0 to 5 parts per million for you SPS heads out there, 1 to 20 parts per million for your LPS, for you softy people out there. That's my range. I'm happy with tanks somewhere in that range, depending on what type of tank that you're trying to keep. Phosphates, 0 to 0.08 for your SPS heads, 0 to 0.5 to 1.2 for your LPS, for you softy heads. Yes, I like nutrients in the tank. I'm not a zero kind of guy. A lot of my tanks that I set up for people who actually have to do things to get nutrients into the tank, I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm not all about getting to zeros. In fact, if things are a zero, then I'm starting to get curious. Even if your test kit says it's 0, there's still likely some amount of that compound in your tank. So there's some gray area there you have to be able to dance with. Now, beyond just nutrients, I don't want to just focus on that and miss other things because there are important parameters. Calcium, 400 to 500, anywhere in that range, I'm happy. Magnesium, 1250 to 1500, again, anywhere in that range, I'm happy with that. I'm not going to get a freak out because ideal water parameters are 440 and I'm at 420. But if I check my calcium and it's a 380, very likely if you do a water change or you up your calcium, your growth is going to return. Same with magnesium. Again, this is all interplane things. These are guidelines for you. Don't get caught up in exactly what your number is. As long as you stay in the range, then your tank is happy. And some numbers just aren't worth chasing at all. I don't go after them. There's a big parameter that I don't chase. If you follow me for any amount of time, you know that I'm not about chasing pH. The ideal pH parameter in the ocean is 8.3, sometimes it's 8.2, but 8.3 is what we say is the ideal. And I see lots of people freak out because their pH isn't 8.3. And to me, I go, whatever. I don't really care where the pH is. I monitor it because Apex comes with a pH probe. Can be useful at times, but I don't freak out about hitting some pH number. It's just not worth going after. Okay, so these are my ideal parameters. Where is my ideal pH parameter? Anywhere from 7.6 to 8.6. Anywhere in there, I'm fine. I'm not worried about raising my pH. I don't chase that one. That's a rabbit hole which you'll spend a lot of money on for minimal, if any, results. Sure, it's sometimes fun when it's the right weather like it was today in Tennessee where you can open up the house and you see the pH number rise and I go, that's cool. That's a nice positive trend on the graph. So what? I'm not going to do anything about it. And then when you close up the house or if you have a gas oven, your pH likely drops. It's like, okay, whatever. As long as it's above 7.6, I'm okay with it. All right, so if these are our starting points, you know where I like having our nutrients, but what do you do if they're too low? Because I've given you the parameters. Now, if you're somewhere in there and you know you're too low, what do I do? Well, there's a couple things you can do. Again, these are suggestions, and one thing that I caution you about is as you're looking at these and hopefully taking notes, what you want to do is try one at a time. Try it for 2 weeks and see what happens in your tank. You don't want to throw 5 of these in the tank at once because then you won't know what was the difference, what made that change. It's very likely that if you go through something once with your tank in terms of lack of coral growth, then you're probably going to experience it again. Sometimes tanks just shut down. A lot of times you're going to see that shut down not only in you're looking at it, you're like, things don't seem to be growing, but your alkalinity rises. I see this a lot with tanks. You can even monitor it from afar. I'll look at my alkalinity and go, not dosing anymore, but all of a sudden my alkalinity is rising. I bet my tank is shutting down. I may have some bleaching. Okay, there's probably something up in my tank. So if your nutrients are too low, what does that look like? Your nitrates are 0 for your SPS tanks out there, and your nitrates are under 5 for your LPS salty tanks out there. Phosphates, again, hitting zeros for your SPS. If you're there, that's too low to me. And for your LPS salty types, you're under 0.05. Okay? What do you do if that's where your tanks are? If that's where your tank parameters are falling out? A couple things that you can do. One, feed your fish more. Your fish will love you for this one. They will always take food. And until you're massive, like, I think it's very, very hard to actually overfeed a fish in the sense that its stomach is going to blow up. Feed your fish more. Now, what I like to do is not feed them all at once. If you need to feed your fish more, feed them more throughout the day. Feed them more often. You can take more food instead of just giving them, let's say, if you feed them 2 cubes at night when you come home from work, all of a sudden you decide you want to feed them 3 cubes. See if you can take that other cube and feed it to them in the morning. Spread out that food as opposed to just throwing all that food in the tank. It's very likely that the more food that you throw, if you throw it at once, won't get eaten. Then it starts to break down. You may be saying, hey, wait a minute, I want nutrients in my tank. I want those things to break down, but what I would rather have is that fish process the waste, produce some waste into the tank. To me, that's more useful than just food that's rotting in the corner. I would like to get some of the bacteria and stuff that comes along with the fish waste because it's not just all about compounds. I also want some of that bacteria stuff in there as well. Okay, the other thing that you can do, here's the one that people always like, you can add more fish. Why the exclamation point? Because make sure that you quarantine your fish, make sure you condition them before you put them in. And here's the thing, adding more fish to your tank isn't something that you can remove that easy. You need to feed your fish more, and then you get nutrients up, and you go, oh, they're up. Then you can back off your food by simply feeding less. You put more fish in your tank, and you go, huh, my nutrients are up. Now I need to bring a fish in, out. They don't just jump into the net and let you take them away. You wish they would, but they don't. So you have to be in a give and take on this one. And here's the thing. Say you have a 120-gallon tank. You have a 200-gallon tank. You're like, okay, I need to add more fish. I'm going to go that route to get more nutrients in the tank. If you add a low bioload fish like a clownfish, a pair of clownfish, or a chromis, a couple chromis into your tank.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
I'm sorry, Siri. Go away. It's very likely not going to do much for your tank. Add some heavy bioload type of fish. This can be tangs. Make sure that you're not going to cause aggression issues as much as you can. Reef safe angels. Maybe you want to have a harem of wrasse or some anthias that need more food. That's going to give you more in terms of nutrient bump than adding low bioload fish like blennies, clownfish, chromis, things like that. Okay. For those of you that have any automation around your tank, cycling your skimmer is something that I will use on clients' tanks. I have clients' tanks to this day that don't run their skimmer 24/7 because they don't have a lot of nutrients in the tank and we want to build it up. Now, word of caution on this one. Number one, just because you're turning off your skimmer, don't expect your nitrates to go from 0 to 5. If they do go from 0 to 5, then I'm going to start turning it on more than how long you were turning off. So say you were turning off for 12 hours, you see a big nitrate bump. Okay, now just turn it on for 6. It's pretty cool if you can see that much of a bump. You probably won't. Again, you have to keep this in mind. This is a relative kind of dance in the gray area type of thing. It's not about all this or all that. You have to find that sweet spot. So cycle your skimmer. This can be done with low-tech type of stuff. You can get one of those old school light timers where you pulled out the little pin and you drug it and it was always off because you never quite knew what time it was. And you put the other pin in there. If you remember that, those were pretty cool back in the day. You can do that with that. If you have an Apex or any kind of tank automation, you can simply add in some quick code to turn that skimmer on and off. Here's what I like to do though. I like to turn it off during the day. For those of you that like to chase pH, you want to have your skimmer on at night to help mitigate that pH drop. Now, if you're seeing your pH drop below 7.7, 7.6, you have your skimmer off at night, run your skimmer at night, change that cycle, and then see what you get. So in that case, yes, I'm going to watch pH there. If it's getting too low, that's likely going to be getting too low at night, and turning on your skimmer could help you. Okay. Here's another one that people make a lot of mistakes with. Remove or reduce your GFO. A lot of times we have those tank calculators. You get a jar of GFO, and you get online, it has a calculator that tells you how much you should use. This is the thing about that. It's one of those absolutes. This is where you have the gray area and learn to listen to your tank. Say that your tank needs 2 cups of GFO. It's very likely that it doesn't actually really need those full 2 cups, especially if you're getting close to getting your nutrients where you want them. Say your nutrients at 1.0 and you're keeping an SPS tank and you want to get down to 0.06. Adding that whole 2 cups of GFO, if that's what's called for, can drop your nutrients really quickly, which can cause problems in terms of growth, potentially even coral death. So I say if your tank, say it needs 2 cups, start with 1 cup and see what happens. That means test your tank's parameters, see what happens. Let the tank tell you how it's going to react or what it's going to do. Just because it says it needs this much on the dosing for the whatever it is, you don't have to do all at once. In fact, I recommend that you don't. Add half and see what kind of results that you get. Okay, so maybe you've gone through this. You still have that your nutrients are too low. Then what? Well, this what you can do is more of a round 2. You can actually add nitrates into your tank. You can add them. Yes, you can actually dose nitrates, which if I told anyone 15 years ago that dosing nitrates would be a great thing for your tank, they would have flamed me on the forum and I would have never gotten invited back. Yes, you can actually add nitrates to your tank if you can get your nitrate levels to rise. Again, if the product that you can use, for example, here's one we sell over at saltwateraquariums.com, the ME Coral nitrate. This is actually nitrate liquid that you can dose. Say that you need to dose 500 milliliters a day. That's what it tells you that you need. Start at 200. See what you get. Dose it. Wait 24 hours. Take a nitrate test with a good nitrate one that test kit. See what kind of results that you get. You don't have to dump it in there because all of a sudden you're throwing your parameters up. You're doing a roller coaster, which your tank doesn't like. So start slow. Now, Another thing that you can do, I hesitate to even put this in here. This is a last ditch kind of effort. I got to hide my eyes. I'm going to put this on the screen. You can feed your corals. Those of you that have been following me for a while, don't fall over and have a heart attack. I know I just said feed your corals. Mostly, I'm not a fan of feeding corals. I guarantee you the most popular topic in this whole webinar series is going to be algae control. And I promise you 95% of people that have an algae problem are feeding their corals. I'm not a feeding a coral fan. Very likely that they don't need the food. I only feed them in specific situations. One's struggling, that doesn't mean it's not growing fast. It got stung, it got damaged, and I need to get that LPS back. Then I will feed the corals. I'm not a fan of just feeding corals to feed corals because they get plenty of food in my experience from things in the water column in photosynthesis. But if you just can't seem to get your nutrients up, you tried everything, you just can't get it there, then you can start feeding your corals. Again, go slow. You don't have to feed at one night. I recommend turning off your pumps. Target feeding those corals. Don't just dump it in the tank, let it blow around. It's very likely that your corals aren't getting any food if you do that. Remember those money machines where they put you in there and there's those dollar bills blowing around, the fan's going, and you can grab, however you can grab, that's how much money you walk out of there with. Usually you don't grab that much. It's the same thing with your corals. You got that little teeny tiny polyp, you got all this flow in your tank, and stuff is just blowing around. The chances of it actually catching any food are quite low. So if you're going to feed, start slow, target feed your corals. That means turning off your pumps, placing coral food down in the polyp for those large polystomes if you can. If you want to feed your SPS, then you want to squirt some of the food at them in the general area. Don't just target feed your tank. And keep in mind, I like to do it at night because the fish are very likely going to swipe the food. Your invertebrates, such as your shrimp, are likely going to swipe whatever coral feed that you put in there as well. So it's a give and a take. Okay, now that my blood pressure is coming back down because I put feed corals in a presentation, only in extreme situations, let's move on and talk about when your nutrients are too high. This is more common with people than too low. All right, your nutrients are too high. How do you know when your nutrients are too high? Your nitrates are more than 5 parts per million for an SPS tank, and for you softy people, they're over 20. Now, too high in an LPS or softy tank, there's a lot of leeway in there. I've seen very, quote, dirty tanks, those LPS and those softies are happy. You got some range there. If it's at 40 and your LPS and your softies are happy and you don't have an algae problem, okay, I'm not worried about it. My experience, when we get above 20 parts per million, even if your soft corals and your LPS are happy, you're probably going to start having algae problems and you have to deal with that. All right, phosphates. Once I'm above 0.8 parts per million on SPS and 1.0 parts per million on LPS softy, then to me, things are too high. Now, again, there's leeway on this. These are guidelines. I've had clients' tanks where the nitrates were 20 and it's an SPS tank and they're growing coral like crazy. Phosphates are 2.0. Yes, 2.0 in an SPS tank, and everything was happy. This is where I talk about learning your tank, learning to listen to your tank. If your tank is up there in that range and things are happy, okay, run with it. Very likely, though, it's not happy. You're looking for answers. Once we get above these levels, to me, things are starting to get too hot. How am I going to bring them back? A couple of easy things that you can do. Feed your fish less. Here's the thing. I'm convinced that a lot of fish are overfed. I've seen fish that are wider than they are longer, and the owner's like, that fish is underfed. I'm like, you're crazy. The thing's going to sink because it's so fat. Fatty liver problems, all that happens with fish. So you can back off your feeding. We talked about feeding more over the course of the day. You can do the same thing with feeding less. If you feed 2 cubes, then still feed 2 cubes a day, but feed 1 in the morning and feed 1 in the afternoon. Don't just cut out that one feeding, make it half as big, spread out the same amount of food over the course of the day. The fish will be happier. If you are feeding your corals, stop really quickly. Like, this is one of those things that I would tell you, if you're doing, like, end of story. Go cold turkey, stop feeding your corals immediately. This is one of the easiest things that you can do. I'm just not a feeding coral fan. Very likely someone's feeding coral, so they have an algae problem. Better gear can help you drop your nutrients. True story. I was talking to a friend of mine, a colleague out in California. He was helping someone on a tank that he serviced. He had a high nutrient problem. They had a bottom of the line skimmer, so he recommended a better skimmer. They put a better skimmer on the tank. He dropped his nutrients. The first thing that the guy said is, does this mean we can put more fish in the tank? Maybe, but probably not. We're trying to drop your nutrients, so you don't immediately get to go throw more nutrients in the tank. Better gear can actually help you drop your nutrients down, mainly in the area of skimmers. Skimmers to me work okay, or they can work really, really well. A good skimmer to me is worth its weight in gold. That doesn't necessarily mean a good skimmer is one that's going to pull out lots of skimmate. I'm also looking for a good skimmer as one that consistently works. It doesn't overflow randomly. It doesn't change its production of skimmate every time you clean it. I've had skimmers that do that. It's consistent. You get it dialed in and just does its thing. One of the easiest things you can do also, if you have too high of nutrient problems, you can add or increase your GFO. Just like we were talking about when things were too low, if things are too high and you want to bring them back, you can start adding GFO. That doesn't mean that you need to add that full amount of dosing that they tell you to. Start with half and see what you get. I have a client who runs a 600-gallon tank. He's got a lot of fish. He had no phosphates for a long time. Then they started to creep up. He puts in half a cup of GFO. I think the recommended dosing for his tank is like 6 cups. He puts in half a cup. Like, it's such a small amount in his media reactor that we have barely any flow going through it. And most people will be like, well, it says 6, you're putting in half, that's not going to do anything. You don't know until you try. Start with a low dose, see what you get. That means you have to test your tank's parameters. Okay, don't go at it all, don't increase it, don't add it all at once. Go slow and see what you get. If your nutrients are too high, you can start carbon dosing. Here's a fun little carbon dose 101. This is not adding activated carbon to your tank. That's totally different. I didn't put it in because adding activated carbon doesn't really help, in my opinion, with your nutrient levels. It's more about making your tank water clear. But carbon dosing is adding a source of carbon to your tank. When you do that, then bacteria eats that carbon up. Then you have this nutrient-rich bacteria, which your corals eat. It's really good natural coral food. But then you have to export that nutrient-rich bacteria. And you do that mainly with protein skimmers. Water changes can work, but you can't do enough of a water change consistently, as in every day or every other day, to make carbon dosing work. You need that constant nutrient export. Good protein skimming is what you do to pair up your carbon dosing to really make it fire off. I have carbon dosed plenty of tanks. I have done very well with carbon dosing. Those of you that have followed me for a long time, my old 90-gallon tank was carbon dosed. It was carbon dosed because I couldn't keep nutrients down, mainly because I had a poor skimmer on the thing. I started adding a carbon dose. Slowly, I didn't do the full amount. Things came down. The tank did really well. So I'm not afraid of carbon dosing. There's lots of ways to get it done. You can do it with a solid type of carbon dose. You can do this, for example, with bio pellets. This is a solid dosing. You put in a media reactor, a special bio pellet type of reactor that's different than a regular media reactor, a GFO or carbon media reactor. That's a solid dosing. Over time, the bacteria eats on that carbon, and then you slowly churn those bio pellets. The bacteria gets knocked off, and you export them with protein skimming. Red Sea makes a very famous product called Nopox. That is a liquid carbon dose. You dose it into your tank. The thing to keep in mind with all these carbon dosing methods is it takes time to get it going. You're growing bacteria. So it's very likely going to take 1, 2, maybe 4 weeks to really get this thing to kick in, because you have to get the bacteria to grow. So don't think that this is an overnight type of thing. That's why I put the clock in there. Be patient. Give it time. Okay. So we're dealing with high nutrients. Round 2 is carbon dosing, and you can also remove your fish. Why the exclamation point? Well, as I said earlier, it's not as easy as putting the net in the tank and going, you get in, and the fish goes, sure thing, not a problem. and then jump in the net. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You might have to tear your tank apart to get that fish out. But removing bioload in your tank, especially if you have some big fish, some big tangs, here's a hint: if you have a flamingo tang, those things kick out a lot of waste. They usually get very big very quick. One of the reasons I don't recommend them for tanks. Those are the fish you want to go after. If you remove your little bunny, you remove a couple chromis or your pair of clownfish, it's very likely not going to do anything. You have to keep context in mind. You want to remove those big bioload fish. Okay. Too low of nutrients, in my opinion, are worse than too high. I think there's a lot more leeway on the high range than there is on the low range. We strip down a tank of nutrients, yes, then that's where I see more problems than tanks that are too high. Usually we've got tanks too high of nutrients, then we have algae problems. That's what we're dealing with, not poor coral growth. All right, there's the stuff that we can't see. There's another piece, another area that has an effect on coral growth, which is lighting. Yeah, that owner didn't clean that light at all. They said they did, but it didn't. But yes, lighting does lead to coral growth. It does make a difference on your coral growth. For example, usually an overlighting issue causes bleaching. Find that it's not usually an underlighting issue. I'll talk about that in a minute. So if you have bleaching in your tank, it's probably overlit. I haven't found that coral stop growing other than if they're bleaching. I haven't found, for example, that the coral still looks good, the color's good, there's some growth, but it's overlit. Usually if you overlight it, then it's going to bleach out. That's more of a key for you. A lot of times it's a fiddling issue. This is especially true with LEDs. One thing about LEDs is they're very easy to change the settings. There's sometimes a knob on the top, or there's an app on your phone. And look, it's pretty tempting. It's pretty cool. You can go in here, you can just jump into the app, you can fiddle with your lighting. You're like, ooh, white lighting. You're like, ooh, blue lighting. Back in the day, you had to wait to change your bulbs. Halide bulbs, there was like 14K, 5K, 20K. Now we can do it very simply with this, and at the same time, I see this causing a lot of problems when people get in here and they go crazy with fiddling with their lights. Just because you can change a lighting parameter doesn't mean that you should. Find what you like. Now look, this again, let's keep this in context. If you're sitting here going, this is what 5K looks like. Okay, I don't like that. That's what 14K looks like. Oh, that's getting better. Okay, 20K, that's what I like. If you're doing this in real time quickly, that's not a problem. Or about when you go, okay, I'm going to try 20K for 2 days. Didn't like 20K. Okay, for the next 2 days, I'm going to try 5K and see what we get. That's when a fill-in comes into being a problem. Also with intensity. I find a lot of people with LEDs overlight their tanks because the thing about LEDs are the spectrums that they kick out. Our eyes, human eyes, a poor judge of how bright it is. A lot of times it doesn't look that bright. So we go, oh, we need to turn them up. In reality, they're plenty bright. Just because you can fiddle doesn't mean that you should. If you want to get in here and make a change, go for it. Make a small change, leave it for a week to 2 weeks, and then see what happens. Now, underlying issues, underlaid issues, SPS, usually I find that they don't grow, but more often they simply brown out. When they brown out, they're usually not growing, so it's a little bit more of a color there that can be a key for you. LPS and softies, underlit, that usually doesn't happen. They usually don't grow. They just sit there. Then that can be a time to turn up your lighting. Now, something about turning up lighting, giving LPS and more softies more lighting, doesn't necessarily mean you have to turn up your intensity. You can simply move them into an area where there's more direct light. If you had them a little bit in the shade or off to the side of one of your fixtures, move them right under the fixture and see what you get. And keep in mind with you, LPS can be hard to see if they're actually picking up on the growth. It's going to be more evident with your softies, especially zoas, where you had a couple polyps. Now all of a sudden you have more polyps. It's easy to see those things start to grow out. LPS is a little bit harder. Okay, coral growth. One thing that I've seen about all my years about building tanks with people and then keeping up with those clients is sometimes the best thing that you can do is leave the tank alone. A lot of times I see people fiddle with their tanks too much. For example, I've built tanks for clients And when you first set them up, like everything's new, right? Like it's shiny and new. It's got that new car smell. Your sump is perfectly clean. There's no any kind of film anywhere. There's no GFO that might have happened to blow on your reactor. Everything is clean. I come back to those systems a year, 2 years later, and it's just as clean as it was on day one. A part of me is like, hey, that's pretty cool. Clearly, you're spending a lot of time in your tank, but I'm convinced that the more time that those people are spending with the tank, fiddling with things, always cleaning, always doing big water changes, always getting their hands in the tank, I think there is something to be said about that, can lead to issues, especially when it comes time to start dealing with problem tanks. People want to change a bunch of things. They're always on the hunt. They're always looking for something. They watch a video online. They'll try 3 different things. There's always a new thing that they want to try. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just leave the thing alone. Let it do its thing. Don't put your hands in there. Don't rearrange it. Like clean your skimmer, test your tank's water. I want you to do that. Don't go fiddling with your tank all the time. Just leave it be and see what happens if you leave it the hell alone. Now, leave it alone, but still test your tank's water and then take notes on what you see that's going on. Sometimes things just reverse themselves by the fact that you're leaving it alone. That doesn't mean you need to stop testing. If anything, keep testing and keep testing those notes, taking those notes and going, things are looking good. Then you can go back and correlate looking good with when did I say that? What were the parameters on that day? Then you start to know. It's something that a lot of time I see is overlooked. Sometimes just leave the thing alone, quit fiddling with it, quit chasing the new thing. A lot of times nature will work itself out. Just leave it be. All right, with that, I'm going to flip it over to questions. This is the time. This is the you time. If you have a question, raise your hand. I will call on you. Make sure you unmute your microphone. And also, if you have a text question, if you would rather not speak, you can write in the question area, and I will reply back there as well. All right, let's see. I'm going to ask the question earlier at the beginning, but did not drop everyone's hand. So I just dropped everyone's hand. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand again, and I'll know that you want to fire off. All right, Brad. Brad T, you're up first. Have at it, Brad. Make sure you unmute your microphone. Welcome to the call.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for the call again this week. It's fantastic. On the nutrients exports, you talk about GFO and different things like that. You never touched on refugiums, algae reactors, things like that. What's your opinion on those for a good nutrient exporter?
Okay, great question, Brad. Thanks for touching on that. What about refugiums? What about algae reactors? Okay, refugiums. My thing about refugiums are I like them. I put them on tanks when I can get a big enough one to do anything. The thing that a lot of times people miss about refugiums are they think, oh, I just have a refugium. That means I'm going to have a better tank. If you put a small refugium on a sizable system or a small refugium on a system that has a lot of nutrients, it's likely not going to do anything. It's like strapping an outboard motor onto a cruise ship and going, you know, we're not going anywhere very fast. So I like to use them, Brad, when I can put a sizable one on. So the other thing about refugiums are it's about surface area. People are like, how many gallons should my refugium be? I'm like, I don't care really about gallons for refugiums. I care about surface area. I want more surface area because the light only goes into the top little bit of the refugium. Once the refugium is covered over, then your nutrient export slows down. For example, I have a tank here in Tennessee that I manage, 500-gallon tank. The refugium on that is about, I think, 36 long, 24 wide, 20 tall. Height doesn't matter, but as soon as that refugium gets covered over with algae, which takes about roughly 2 weeks, then I'll see the nitrates start to rise because the algae isn't growing anymore. It's not sucking up those nutrients. Then what I do is I get in and I haul out a 5-gallon bucket worth of Chaeto and Chlorpa and the other type of macros that are in there. And then I see nutrient levels start to drop again. So I want that refugium to be something sizable. Algae reactors are a way to do that in a smaller footprint because it just increases the area that's exposed, the algae that's exposed to the light, which means you get more nutrient exports out of them. So if you have the space, I like to go the traditional refugium route because they're fun to watch as well. You get all kinds of critters in there. You get copepods and stuff crawling around. It's like an ant farm. You're like, ooh, I have an aquatic ant farm. And it's cool. I like to see them. You can put mangroves in there. I don't put the mangroves in for nutrient export. I put the new mangroves in there because they look cool and you can grow bonsai mangrove type of thing. Algae reactors are a great way to do that if you don't have the space for a refugium, or if you would not like to do a refugium, you can do it inside of an algae reactor. I found that those work pretty well. If you need a lot of nutrient export, a lot of times they only get so big, or you only have more space, you only have so much space to put them on. You might have to add multiple algae reactors to get that done. So now, the other thing that Brad, you didn't ask about in terms of algae for nutrient export is turf scrubbers. I like those in my experience. I like them from the sense that it's, in a way, it's a refugium. It's per se a natural type of nutrient export. I've found a lot of times they look a little more DIY-ish. Yes, there's some commercially produced ones. They've come down in price a little bit, but I always used to chuckle because they're like, get our turf scrubber and you can drop your skimmer. But the turf scrubber costs more than the skimmer. I'm like, how are we doing ourselves any good? Turf scrubbers can look okay. You very likely have to have the space to do it. You've got to do some plumbing around it. A lot of times I found that they're loud. They're getting better. I just haven't jumped into them because if I don't have the space for a refugium, then I found the skimmer and the GFO in a well planned out stocking strategy can get the job done, or I have the place for a refugium. Great question, Brad. Long answer, but you brought up a great area there. All right, Bruce F. I'm going to hand it over to you, Bruce. Have at it.
Hi, Mark. I was just kind of curious on, PAR values and what you think about those. And I know it varies depending on LPS versus SPS, but do you have any sort of tips on how you look at the PAR values?
Great question. What do I look at in terms of PAR values? So this is a fun gray area for me because I'm a numbers guy. I like to look at numbers. A lot of times I feel like I can find a number and then find an answer, or look at a graph and find an answer. And this hobby constantly reminds me it's not that way. PAR values are a definite number. Our PAR readers have gotten a lot better, especially with the LEDs. So where do I go with that? Number one, I found there's a lot of leeway. I don't know what the PAR value is in this tank. I took them once on my old tank. I don't even know where I wrote those numbers down. They're probably in a video that I did, but I don't go chasing them. When I go and set up a new client's tank, I don't go in there and go, okay, here are the PAR values. I need to get this PAR value up right here, another 50. So we're going to raise this light, but not that one. I start low, especially with LEDs. A lot of times starting your LED fixture at 40% and then going up from there is fine. What I do is I'll start at about 40, especially when there's no coral in the tank. But as I start to grow coral, put it in and it starts to grow, then I start to increase it. And what I'll do is I'll just go up 5% every week to 2 weeks and see what happens. Are the softies still happy about it? If not, I may not drop that PAR value. What I'll likely do is just move that softie out of the way. Are the SPS still happy? If I'm having bleaching, then I'll back off on the lighting. I'm not chasing a number. It's more about overall percentage for me. If you wanted to break it down to a number, Bruce, like if you got 100 PAR in the sand bed, that was kind of the old gold standard. I found that works pretty dang well as well. If I'm getting 100, then what I'll do is I'll jump up to the top of the coral stack where my SPS are. I like to keep it really no more than 400 or 500 max PAR. Really 300 is okay too. And then I know I'm going to put my higher light SPS up there. And if things are happy, okay, maybe I want to get ambitious and crank it up. My old 450-gallon tank, I got the lights on that thing up to about 90, and that's where I found everything was happy. So I kept it there, higher than I would have thought, but I'm just going up. I never took a PAR reading for what the value was. It was more of a look and a feel type of thing than an actual value. But if you have a PAR reader, really for me, 100 on the sand bed, I'm going to be okay with that. All right, let's go to a text question here. Let's see. I have a question about, is a bleached coral or frag unrecoverable? I purchased 2 coral frags, which I thought had pests, moved and dipped them. The second wasn't sure, but they dipped it anyway. So what do you do at this point? All right, is a bleached coral or frag unrecoverable? Really, to me, it's more about, is it recoverable? Yes. Really thinking about SPS here. As long as that piece of coral has polyp extension or polyps on it, you can see polyps. They don't necessarily have to be extended. As long as you can see polyps, very likely still alive. When it's just skeleton, or you can see all where the polyps were, the holes in the coral skeleton, then it's dead, then it's not coming back. Now, in terms of LPS, when those guys leave down, then I may go to a food, start feeding them a little bit, target feeding them. In my experience, softies don't bleach out, they just fade away. But certainly I've had plenty of corals that are bleach out and they come screaming back. So I don't give up on it until the thing has no polyps on it whatsoever. You can't see it. Then I go on from there. All right, great question. Let's go over to a live question. Let's jump to the bottom of the alphabet because people always forget about people on the bottom. All right, Tim A., you're on.
Hi, Mark. So my question is, what if you're, what if you're out of line with one nutrient but not the other? So maybe your nitrates are a little high, but your phosphates are a little low. So how do you bring that back in line, so to speak?
Okay, so if your nitrates are high or phosphates are low or vice versa, likely if you're going to affect one, then it's going to affect the other. For example, if you start feeding your fish more, your nitrates are probably going to come up with it, and your phosphates can likely come up as well. Now, the nice thing about phosphates are you can always pull or reduce your GFO. That's an easy way to get just to fiddle with that one parameter. If you wanted to raise your nitrates, then you can simply start dosing nitrates, for example. That's how I would go with it. It's still a dance there. Unless things are hitting zero, if one's a little low but the other's okay and the tank looks all right, then I would be okay with it. Keep in mind too that a lot of times with these test kits, if it says that it's zero, even if it's, for example, like a lot of times with ammonia test kits, they tell you that it's 0.25. It's so low that they actually can't test that. It's just telling you that there's some presence of that. Also keep in mind, just because your nitrates or phosphates is zero doesn't mean there's absolutely none in the tank. It just means it's so low that that test kit couldn't grab it. So you got some leeway there, Tim. That's a fun kind of dilemma to be in. A lot of times nutrients are just high across the board and people are like, where do I even start with that? Bob's on the video or the call with us tonight. Bob's one of those guys who has an old reef tank where nitrates and phosphates are off the charts, but is doing really well. One thing I found is that older tanks are more tolerant of higher nutrient issues than the younger ones. I think they just get set in their ways and then they're okay with it. All right, Robert Y., you're on. Robert, make sure you unmute your microphone. It says you're muted. We want to hear what you had to say. Have at it, Robert. Turn on that mic.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for hosting us again tonight. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here.
So we've spoken before, and it's been quite a hiatus for me, 15 years. And back then, I never took the jump to corals. So it's a whole new world for me that I'm trying to learn about. And you mentioned not feeding them. And I've seen everything from the powder, the Refroid, mix it, to, like you said, direct feeding them. Can you just give me a brief synopsis of what you mean exactly? Otherwise, water changes and trace elements and what's going on in my refugium. Good enough.
You're asking about feeding corals?
Correct.
Okay. So what specifically is it about feeding corals that you want to know? Because I want to make sure I get your question answered.
So you had mentioned that if the nutrients were, well, basically you said that you don't suggest feeding corals, that, you know, the water changes and the trace elements that are hopefully there, along with what's going on and maybe your refugium, natural things, copepods, etc., growing, just naturally what's in the water column is good enough? Or do I need to be purchasing specific, you know, powdered or Refroid type things to, you know, feed? I mean, of course, I'm going to have a spread of coral, maybe probably not the SPS to begin with, but.
Okay. Okay, great. I'm clear now. All right. So I found that most tanks that have algae problems, people are feeding their corals. And when you feed corals, then it tends to lead to an algae problem because you're pumping nutrients into your tank. Easiest way to think about this is if you go sit down and eat a bunch of cheeseburgers all the time, and then you're very likely going to start gaining weight because you're pumping all that energy in the form of calories into your body. It's the same with a tank. You start pumping in this coral food. A lot of it doesn't get eaten. It blows around and starts breaking down in your tank. Now you've got all those nutrients that you have to deal with. I found that in a well-run reef tank, I've got a good amount of fish in there. The lighting is right. Those corals are going to do just fine. Some people would argue that if you feed your corals, they're going to grow faster, which there's probably some proof to that. And it's going to be very hard to see and actually quantify that. I started feeding, and then my growth picked up. Now, the exception to this is an aquaculture type of facility. They want all the growth that they can possibly get. They can do large water changes very easily, so they're pumping in a whole bunch of food. I get that. But in terms of for most of us to do that, I'm not a fan. I found that it causes problems in the tank. It's a very easy thing to cut out, and I've been surprised over the years about how many tanks will recover because we've cut out that coral food. Now, I will feed a coral if it's struggling. For example, LPS that got stung or got damaged, then I'll feed it. I'll target feed. I like the fauna marine LPS pellets, the medium ones for that. Thing about feeding is turn off your pumps. You want to place that food right down in the polyp near the mouth, because what's going to happen is your shrimper and permacrabs are going to come running out. Literally, it's like a stampede, and they'll swipe it and they'll steal it. But SPS, I don't feed. Softies, I certainly don't feed. Just let it go. Your tank will be quite happy about that. All right, Muno says, I have a 60-gallon all-in-one tank. What do I recommend for biological filtration? Is refugium a must? I've got 5 fish in it, and my kids like to feed the fish a lot. Kids, tank sitters, always overfeed your fish. So Muno, what do you do for a 60 all-in-one? You can put a refugium on there. There's those hang-on back things. They may do something for you. Your kids might have more fun watching the little aquatic ant farm in the refugium than feeding your fish. That would be a bonus for you. An algae reactor, like we talked about earlier, may be an option, because if you have an all-in-one, you probably don't have a sump. You're probably not going to be adding in a refugium. That may help you. Carbon dosing, but any of this stuff I'm only going to be doing once there is a nutrient problem in the tank. You ask about what do you need to do for biological filtration. All those things are things that I would do once I have a nutrient problem. My everyday in and out biological filtration is going to be handled by my live rock in the tank. So I'm not adding on those things with the carbon dosing or the algae reactors as something that is an everyday biological filtration. It's something that's only there if I have a problem. Great question. Let's see. Let's go to another live question. All right, Nicholas L. I'm going to unmute you, Nicholas. Turn your mic on and fire away.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. Thanks for doing a series again. I have a question for you. As a tank is cycling up, what are we looking at as far as acceptable nitrate levels, nitrite, especially new tank syndrome, trying to watch all of that, obviously ammonia, watching everything kind of cycle up till we get to the point to adding coral. And then at that point in time, when is it safe to add coral? At what point, I'm assuming once we kind of hit our fish list, when does it officially settled out?
Okay, great question. So first of all, Nicholas, I've been using bacteria and bottle products for 10 years now. I don't see cycles anymore. I don't go through the 3 week to 1 month of ammonia rise and then fall, and then nitrite rise and then fall, and your nitrates come up. I add in some fish that have been pre-quarantine. I dump in bacteria in a bottle product. I like the Dr. Tim's One and Only. I like the Fritz Turbo Start 9. And the next day I see probably a little bit of nitrates, and that tells me the tank is, quote, cycled up, as you said. I don't see this long run and rise of things like in the old days. Now, if you want to do it that way, there's nothing wrong with it. Once I see my nitrates come in, they start rising, then I know that I'm getting to the end of the cycle. Once I've, quote, cycled the tank, then I wait about 2 weeks before I put coral in. What I'm wanting is to get some biofilm on the tank, some slime on that surface, because you're really not necessarily growing coral, you're growing biofilms and bacteria. Then I put some starter corals in the tank and I see what I get. It's really canary in the coal mine at that point. Put some softies in, put some hardy LPS, like candy canes, and you just see what you get. Do they do well? Do they not do well? There's not a marker for me in terms of now that I've hit this nutrient level, now it's safe to put coral, other than if I have ammonia there, I have nitrites, okay, that looks like I'm not going to put coral in there. Great question. Good luck with the new tank, and of course, enjoy. Let's take one more question here. All these live people got really quiet. We'll take one more live. We'll take one more text. All right, Jeff D. You've been with us, I think, just about every week. Thanks for being with us, Jeff. Unmute your microphone. It says you're muted so that we can hear you.
My pleasure. Thank you again, Mark. And yes, I believe I've gone to every single one of these. So thanks for having them. I was really happy when I heard you're extending them out for more weeks. Anyway.
Good to know. Thanks for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. All right, so for my question, first time I actually heard you say you're very adamantly against feeding corals, and I kind of found that interesting. Specifically wanted to ask about LPS corals. I've specifically got some acans and a lobo that I usually feed once or twice a week, drop some mysis shrimp in it, it gobbles it right up, it seems to love it. The only reason I ask about this is because I went away on a vacation, I don't know, like 6 months ago for 2 weeks and was like, I'm going to let the corals go and just obviously not feed them. Didn't have the tank sitter feed the corals. It was gone for about 2 weeks, came back, noticeably saw a visible difference with the lobo, just not as big, thick, puffy polyps. It just seemed like it wasn't happy, and then feed it some and it comes right back to life. So I hear yours and go, do I want to back off my coral feeding because my nutrients are higher than I want? But when I went and not fed it, I did see some negative declines. So wanted to kind of get your opinion on it.
Okay, great question, Jeff, and I'm glad that you got to get away before all this craziness came down. So lobos, LPS, lobos, trichophilias, what some people used to call Welsophilias, open brains. Lobos to me are hardier than the trachs and the open brains. I've had no success with trachs or open brains. In fact, I don't even tell clients to buy them because they just don't make it. A lot of times because my tanks are, quote, too clean. Those corals, one thing to keep in mind about them, they're not necessarily living in dirty water. They are living in water where it's very murky. A lot of times they're covered in silt. So they're not getting a lot of light, but they are surrounded by a bunch of slime and other things so they can constantly be taking in nutrients out of the water column. So if you're feeding it and you saw some good results, then you stop feeding it and then things weren't so well, to me, that's telling me that the air tank is really too clean for that type of coral. In that case, sure, I would keep feeding that coral, but I'm going to be target feeding it, and it's going to get like 2 pellets, and that's all it's going to do. The other thing you can try to do is move it out of the light. Maybe you can put a little bit in the shade, give it less flow. I've seen logos not get as puffy as normal because they're getting too much flow. Those are all different things that you can do. If you're feeding that one coral that little amount and you have a nutrient problem, you're very likely not causing a nutrient problem because you're feeding that small amount, in which case I would do it. I'd be looking for other areas in your tank to reduce your nutrients while you keep feeding that coral. Again, just that targeted amount. You want to make sure that thing actually gets to eat it. You got to swipe, keep your inverts away. If you do it during the day, you got to keep your fish away. But it's very likely there's other things that you can do to, quote, clean up your tank's water and still keep your lobo happy. I've got plenty of lobos in my tanks, in this tank here, and the nitrate on this tank tests down at 0. I tested it the other day, and those guys are still happy. So some of it depends on your lobos as well. I found the orange and red and blue ones always tend to do well. The really wild colored lobos, they always look great to me, but I know that they're never going to make it, unfortunately. So it may be partly the type of lobo that you have. All right, Manny has a question here. He's going to wrap us up tonight. Manny from South Florida FMAS. Certainly know your FMAS guys. I hope you all are doing well on your continued lockdown there. Said it previously had a refugium with tons of chaeto and had harvested almost weekly. Also started using Brightwell biofuel, and my nitrates stay around 5 to 10 and phosphates are 0.03 to 0.1. I had a chaeto and had a minor crash a while back. It doesn't really grow, but the phosphate does go up. At this point, I'm just using the refugium for pods with my mandarin. So would the Chaeto grow to help with pods, even with carbon dosing? All right, Manny, so great question. This is where carbon dosing really gets fun. The thing about carbon dosing is you're growing bacteria to eat nutrients. Bacteria process nutrients are way more effective and way more efficient than algae. Like, I think it's like 10 times or more. I'll have to ask Dr. Tim about that. It's crazy how much more efficient bacteria are, because those bacteria that are eating those nutrients that you're exporting, that you're growing with carbon dosing, those guys double in number, I think, every 20 minutes. So they're going gangbusters, whereas algae is kind of like the poking turtle. It's like, we're going to get there, but we're not going to get there real fast. So if you're carbon dosing, don't be surprised if your refugium of all the Chaeto, whatever microalgae in there, dies, because the bacteria is out competing it. Now, since you have both, you may be able to back off your carbon dose, which is going to let your refugium have a little bit of food and get it to grow. But I'm not surprised at all that your Chaeto isn't growing or isn't growing much when you're carbon dosing. I see some people that are carbon dosing and they have an algae reactor and they have a refugium, and I call that confused tank syndrome. You got all these different systems that are fighting one another. If you're trying to carbon dose to get your nutrients down, it would increase your carbon dose a little bit, say goodbye to your refugium. Or if you want to back off your carbon dose, then it may help your refugium comes back. But really, you got two different systems doing two different things, and the bacteria is going to be way more efficient than that refugium. Stay safe, Manny. I hope you're enjoying the sun down there in southern Florida. Thank you, everyone, for being with me tonight. Next week, we're talking about coral color, what to do when you're not getting good color. How do you deal with that? What are some telltale signs of that? That's what we're talking about next Sunday night, same time at 8:30 p.m. Central. Thanks, everyone, for being with me. Thanks for being part of this new Problem Tank webinar. If you're having a problem with your tank, don't give up. Hang in there. Stay with the thing. Lean into it. You started this hobby to have a jam and a reef tank, or just to enjoy your fish, whatever it is. If it's a combo of both, that's cool too. Sometimes things don't go well. That's just part of the hobby. I heard someone once say that between a good hobbyist and a really good hobbyist is a person who's been through fire several times and they stuck with it. So if you're going through hell, keep going. Have a great night. I will catch you next Sunday evening.